Good evening, everybody. My name is John Mulhern. I'm the principal of the Teagasc College of Amenity Horticulture, and we're based in the National Botanic Gardens. And I'd like to welcome you all this evening here to what is a beautiful sunny evening in Dublin. And wherever you are, I hope the weather is shining on you too. So this evening, our students, our Level 5 Certificate in Horticulture students, as part of their leadership module in the horticulture program, are staging an event. And this would be one of the events that they would normally stage in a face-to-face manner, but obviously because of the situation that we all find ourselves in, where the students are running this online. And they have a very good lineup this evening for you. Their event is called Back to Nature. And I think it's a topic that we can all identify with. We're coming out of an unprecedented event in our history. And I think we all want to return to something. So now is the time. And I think it's very apt that the students, along with their tutors, have staged this event called Back to Nature. So a number of the students are going to introduce the speakers, but I want to wish everybody the very best from our side. We've had a very difficult year, I suppose it's fair to say, a very different year for our training with our students. It has been a year like no other. We've had to embrace the online platform like no other. There's pluses and minuses, there's no doubt about it. And I think our staff and our students have really raised the bar for themselves in terms of getting to grips with technology and getting to grips with getting over the line with their Level 5 program. I do predict that next year will be a whole lot better. I do predict that we'll be in a much better place. And I'm sure you'll all join with me in that. And we look forward to seeing the students who will be returning to us to do Level 6 or Level 7 down the road. And we really want to embrace that. I'm not going to say any more because this is a student event and I really want to wish each and every one of the students well in their event this evening, along with their tutors, Louise Jones, Margie Phillips, and I think Christine Murray is also involved in this module. She might be on this evening, but the best of luck to the three tutors and to the students. So it's my pleasure to hand over now to Brendan Doyle, who's going to introduce the first speaker. So over to you, Brendan, and the best of luck.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everybody. My name is Brendan Doyle, and I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker of this evening. Her name is Nikki Darrell, and she's the principal of the Plant Medicine School based in Galway. Nikki sets up, designs, and teaches the courses down the Plant Medicine School. So I'll hand you over to Nikki now, but before I do, just if you have a question, there's a chat button at the bottom here, and beside it, there's a Q&A. If you pop your question into the Q&A, we'll look after that for you. Over to you, Nikki.
Thanks very much, Brendan. And thank you so much to your class for inviting me to speak at this webinar. And it's just a wonderful lineup. I apologize for being a bit tired this evening. This is my fourth Zoom of the day, which isn't a normal day for me. So I hopefully won't be too tired presenting this. So the subject I was asked to talk about was herbal medicine, which is a huge topic. So we'll only be able to cover some small snapshots. I won't be talking about uses of individual herbs, but very much putting this in the context of Ireland, our history and heritage with herbal medicine here, and the whole potential for a real growth in the herbal sector in Ireland. Just a little bit more about me. I've been passionate about plants and their capacity to keep us healthy, but also keeping our livestock, our soil, our ecosystems healthy, and their healing properties from a very early age. I grew my first packet of herb seeds when I was about 9 and bought my first book on herbal medicinal plants when I was about 11. When I was choosing what to study at college, I couldn't find anywhere to study herbal medicine, so I went to study horticultural and plant science, and I'm delighted that I had that start because it really tied up that whole area of how do we grow, how do we look after the plants as well as the health aspects. After I finished at college, I went and worked in research for about 5 years, and then I met some people who were studying at a herbal college in the UK, so I decided to train. So really, I suppose my working life in the herbal world started about 31 years ago, where I had a small herb nursery based down in Cork. And I was really hoping to be working a lot more with growing the herbs, but that's really only happening now. We're hoping over the next few years to make the plant medicine school self-sufficient in the herbs that we give to students for samples and for demonstrating how to make the different medicines from them. Because now that we're up in Gorey, we have 5 acres altogether up here. So we're starting with bringing 2 into cultivation this year, and we'll expand out from there. So the plant medicine school is very much a nature-centered enterprise. I'm very much committed to teaching people about the herbal heritage that we have in Ireland, and also how to use herbal medicines at home, the whole domestic home medicine side of it, but also community herbalism. And we do train people up to clinical practitioner level, and we're hoping to be teaching a lot more about herb growing. And woven through all this is very much the nature-centered ethic and nature connection. We have a very rich and vibrant history in Ireland and connection with the plants. Peter Wise-Jackson, who's a former director of the Botanic Gardens, wrote a book called Ireland's Generous Nature, which is a comprehensive account of the historical and present day uses of wild plant species in Ireland. It's got a lot of traditional knowledge in it, and it's great to see that being written in such a comprehensive and accessible way. Also, we have within the folklore department at UCD, in the 1930s, the Folklore Commission sent school children out to talk to people in rural areas to actually write about the use of native plants and traditional healing. So we're unusual in this part of the world, and actually in Europe, that we have quite a rich ethnobotanical record of our relationship with herbal medicine. We're also very lucky. We have an amazing climate here for growing plants. So as well as our native plants having some great medicines, plants like valerian and elder, both the flower and the berry of the elder, are used for the heart, the circulation and the memory. Of the hawthorn, that is. The elder tree, the flowers are used for things like hay fever and congestion, and the berries, as we know, are really good for our immune function. And then we have very common plants that we might think of more as weeds, like dandelion, and the root of dandelion has attracted a lot of interest in recent times because it's been shown that dandelion root is very valuable for preventing mutagenesis in cells. So in other words, it helps to protect us against cancer. Nettle is well known. Lots of people still take it as a spring tonic, and it's a wonderful source of iron and other minerals. Then we have little plants like eyebright, which is wonderful for the mucous membranes, ground ivy, which is used for a big range of different things. It's a nerve tonic. Again, it's good for our mucous membranes. It's good for our digestion. This is one of the exciting things about herbs and plant medicine, is that when we work with the whole plant, they have a capacity to treat a range of problems rather than isolated substances targeting one particular symptom. And the other value of using the whole plant like that is that it also means that less side effects, because there are all sorts of buffering and other compounds that help the bioavailability and make them more a softer medicine, although still powerful medicines for keeping us healthy, but also treating disease. Another very common plant that has attracted interest recently is bramble. A few years ago, Simon Meehan won the Young Scientist of the Year award for his research on bramble extract, showing that bramble is effective against MRSA, and also showing high levels of antioxidants and potential for improving general health and immune function. Simon's grandfather was a traditional herbalist and had also done some research on elecampane, and also the use of that for MRSA. Now, elecampane, we're not sure if that's a naturalized or a native plant, and that's the case for quite a few plants. So as long as alongside the native plants, we have the naturalized ones, many of which are very valuable. And then we have introduced plants that grow here splendidly. So we have plants like rosemary, which again is full of antioxidants, used a lot for as a food preservative. Also used for the memory as well, and for liver disease. And there's a small town in northern Italy where they noticed people were living very long lives and staying very active into their 80s and 90s and so on. So they went to research about this, and they found that the people there, their diet was mainly consisted of chemical-free grown, not necessarily organically certified, but grown without chemicals, homegrown vegetables, lots of local rabbit and chicken. But the other thing that was there was they included huge amounts of rosemary in their diet. And they found that this rosemary was actually what was keeping them young and active, protecting their hearts and all sorts of other things, their memories as well. We've also got plants like thyme, which is excellent for respiratory problems and digestive problems. Some of the sister species, specifically Incarnus and Ladanifer, have been shown to be effective antivirals, and are used in Poland both to prevent and treat Lyme disease. And we have a little plant called Hoitonia, or also known as chameleon leaf, that you find in a lot of garden centres. It's grown as an ornamental, but that's been researched recently for treating urinary infections and again improving immune function. Myrtle is another one that a lot of people grow in their gardens, and that's been shown very effective for gum health and for digestive function, preventing inflammation in the guts. These are just little snapshots of what some of these plants do. So we have a big history here. In the 1930s, Professor O'Reilly in Cork University suggested that in the agriculture and horticultural sector, we focused on peatland management, forestry, and growing medicinal and aromatic plants as crops in Ireland. And that didn't necessarily happen at the time, but we are now finding a great resurgence in interest in the whole area. And I'll come back to that. I think first I'd like to say what is emerging is that plants have a huge value for our own microbiome, and we're all beginning to understand the importance of healthy gut microbiomes. So Christine Jones, some of you may have heard of, she's talked at Biofarm the last couple of years, and she talks about how if we eat 30 different plants a week, then this keeps our microbiome healthy. And when we start looking at some of these herbs and native plants, we can look around and see it's actually quite easy to include that number of plants a week from just outside our doors, rather than depending on a lot of imported foods and so on. There's a massive diversity out there that we've been overlooking. The plants are also important for the soil microbiome, and they support the development of a healthy mycorrhiza and soil bacteria levels. So by growing the right plants, we can also make sure that healthy soil microbiome will actually build, and this actually promotes healthy growth of crops too. So we can see how some of these plants can be used for intercropping and so on to promote healthy plant growth. In the world, about 80% of the world's population still depend on herbs as part of their primary health care. And the World Health Organization has always promoted this for various reasons. One is it is more culturally appropriate, and they find that when people understand their medicine, they find it works better, literally. Obviously, that's one factor. It's also a cheaper system for medicine and actually very effective. So there's a lot of research carried out in various areas of the world on the efficacy of plant medicine because it's used so widely. This is done more in the non-English speaking world for various reasons. But when we look at research from Eastern Europe, Russia, China, India, Africa, we see more and more how much value there is in incorporating herbs into our healthcare. And this is something that's very much a vision for a lot of herbalists, to see herbal medicine taking a more central role in our healthcare again. When I was a kid, we're going back to sort of like the 60s, 70s, 50% or more of medicines in pharmacies were still plant-based, actually, but that's shifted over time. And talking to people in the farming world, they would remember taking animals to the vets. A few decades ago, there was a lot more advice on using plants and plant-based medicines. And with what's happening as regards the sustainability, especially the fact that, some of the antibiotics are losing their efficacy, looking at the cost of some of the pharmaceuticals and so on, the reincorporation, if you like, of herbal medicine can have a huge role to play. So I mentioned a few regions where plants are very widely used, and often the more local plants are more widely used. And they're not just used to treat disease, but also used to help people stay healthy. So there'd be a little bit less of a divide sometimes between the foods and the medicines. There'd be lots of winter tonics. I was talking to one of my colleagues recently, and he remembers his grandmother dosing them all with elderberry vinegar in the winter to keep them healthy. And various things like that can be done through the seasons and through the year, or for people who know they've got a constitutional weakness. So there's a whole idea of a wellness paradigm, if you like, that can be brought in to how we use herbs. I suppose in this part of the world, because of advertising and so on, we often think that we have to look at exotic plants from distant shores for our superfoods and herb supplements and so on that are sold over the counter, which is a shame in some ways. Some of those plants are amazing, but supply chains are changing. And so the actual how things get around the world, we've seen quite a lot of hiccups in that over the last year. And that's something that's not going to go away. Also, some regions are beginning to understand the value of their own herbs, so they're sort of not exporting as much. Also, the wildcrafting that is carried out in regions like Eastern Europe and so on is not particularly well paid. We get our herbs from abroad a little bit too cheap. And so there's an aging population of wildcrafters, and young people aren't interested in entering the vocation because they figure they can earn money in other ways. So there's lots of reasons at the moment why people are beginning to look at herb production localizing, and that would be people getting to understand more about the local herbs, and that includes the herbal practitioners who have been very privileged over the last while to be using things from all around the world, and they're now realizing that they need to learn more about the local plants. So that's one aspect of it, but also for ourselves in our communities to realize what a wealth there is there. I mean, we've seen an upsurge in foraging, and there's also people looking at producing artisan products. So we're seeing more and more of those being produced, and looking at how to produce here with the potential to export, most particularly into Europe. So there's huge potential there. We used to have a more prolific, what's called a MAP sector, which means medicinal and aromatic plant sector. And plants were grown for export specifically to the United Kingdom, but also for use in our own healthcare system. And actually what's happening now is there's a lot of interest in entering into this kind of work again. So we have people looking at growing native plants and trees, learning how to harvest them and looking for market for them. And also growing things like some of the mushrooms, things like lion's mane, oyster, turkey tail, ganoderma, and so on, which are very prized in the herbal world now. Farming seaweeds as well. And I suppose what's happening is with the costs of inputs in conventional farming, more and more farmers are looking at biofarming, regenerative farming, crop diversification. There's organizations like Farming for Nature. We have an ideal climate for growing many herbs. So there's some very exciting projects starting around the country. Borden and Mona have put down, I can't remember how many acres, but they're doing a sort of regeneration of bog. They're primarily growing about 10 to 15 species, and it's mainly actually, ironically, for export to China, because the Chinese like the idea of our clean air, and they're growing everything organically for that market. But there's other projects starting who are looking to supply into the European and UK market. So there's one example would be Plantain, who are a major herb supplier in the UK and also supply into the European market. So they have set up their Plantain EU venture in North Wexford. And they are starting off with 10 acres of herb growing, which they're planning to expand. And they're starting off with about 35 species, and that will increase as well. And the idea is after the initial wrinkles of what will grow and won't grow, and some more research into what practitioners and people are looking for, and some more education of people into the uses of some of the things that can be grown here. Their plan is to be partnering with farmers around the country as the project expands. So they've got a large drying unit and are planning to do processing as well. It's quite an exciting project. There's all that side of it. And then there's people are looking towards more natural and cheaper ways of keeping healthy, because this is part of it as well. There's a lot of hunger to learn what our grandparents and ancestors knew. And when we were chatting before we started, we were talking about how there is a resurgence in interest in horticulture, in growing, in biodiversity, in doing these things naturally, and a huge interest in how to use herbs to keep healthy and treat ourselves if we do get sick. So the school has seen in the last year, we could have filled our courses about 4 times over. This year we're fully booked up, and the school is expanding to accommodate more and more people learning, because in our view, we can't have too many people knowing about how to use the things just outside their doors. And spreading this information. And as I say, it increases biodiversity. So this is something that we do in the school, is quite a bit of research into some of the forgotten herbs, if you like. I think one of the very exciting ones over the last few years has been seeing how effective daisies are. A lot of you might use arnica gels or homeopathic arnica for aches and pains. And daisy is the plant that used to be used here, the ordinary lawn daisy. And with the evidence we're getting from people using daisy to treat things like bruising and arthritis, it seems that it's actually more effective than arnica. Arnica is a plant that comes from the Alps and grows in a very specific region, and has been very over harvested, if you like. So as we start to remember our local herbs, it means it takes pressure off some of these species too. And it gets people actually being able to see the value in some of the plants that we have maybe undervalued. Another one that's attracted a lot of interest is rose bay willow herb, which is actually used to be sold before black tea was imported to this part of the world. People used to gather and dry rose bay willow herb, and it's got all sorts of different names in different areas. It's called, I think, St. John's tea in the Ukraine, and very well much known as something that helps calm and bit like, you know, having the cup of black tea at the end of a stressful day or whatever. This is what we've used before. It's also helps with gut health, helps balance our gut microbiome, used for treating urinary problems and other things like heavy menstruation. So it's got a huge range of therapeutic value as well. Plantain is one that we've looked at a lot, fascinating herb that is really excellent for tissue repair. There's so many others that we could mention. Really, pretty much we have about 365 native plants, most of which, there are some exceptions, like we don't use foxglove, and there's a couple of others that are too toxic to use, but so many of them have a value. Billberry is one that's attracted a lot of interest over recent times, because it fits into our endocannabinoid system, which is now being understood to be a big part of healthy immune function, and all sorts of other areas of our health. It also helps regenerate nerve damage and has been shown to be effective in treating complex trauma and PTSD. So a huge amount of knowledge to reclaim. And I suppose the exciting thing is this is being added to all the time with research from around the world. I suppose as well, there's scales. There's what people can grow outside their own doors. And this has huge potential for horticulturists who are growing for supply to garden centres and so on, because I mentioned plants like Hoitonia cistus, the rosemaries and thymes, the myrtles and so on, that more and more people are looking to grow them in their garden as they learn that they're valuable. Then we've got the artisan producers producing either food products or simple medicines, the whole area of some of the microbreweries and people producing sort of boutique gins and meads and all of this kind of thing are looking for herbal supplies. We've got the whole sort of skincare area and so on. And so there's small producers, and then obviously the farmers looking to grow for the larger companies. So as I say, there's a massive potential with this whole area. So I'm just about to finish off here. I suppose today, my day-to-day, the first Zoom, I was talking to a group of people involved in herbal education and how we bring that forward into the 21st century. In the second one, it was talking to somebody involved in the UK Herb Growers Cooperative, and how we can link up with farmers and link up with this whole area of sustainability and supply chains and re-educating people about what is outside our doors and what we can grow locally and use. So there's a real regeneration and revitalization of herbal medicine. So it's exciting times to live in. So I hope that gave you a bit of an insight into the whole area of herbal medicine. I will put up a link to the Plant Medicine School website where there are little monographs on individual herbs, and you can learn a bit more about what we do there. And I'll also put up a link to, I have written a book called Conversations with Plants, The Path Back to Nature. So I guess I'll put up a link to where you can get that. Is published by Eon Books. So thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Nikki. That was great. Thanks for the informative talk on a huge topic and a fascinating topic as well. There's been a few questions, quite a lot of questions actually in the Q&A, very diverse questions, and so I'm just going to have to choose one or two. We have about 5 minutes. So one of them is quite a practical question. So you mentioned in the presentation about growing about 30 plants, growing and eating 30 plants and herbs on a kind of window outside your kitchen door. What would you recommend us growing to stay healthy, apart from just the usual stuff like parsley, sage, basil, rosemary?
Okay, well, I suppose like we discussed this with a group of students the other day because we were doing some recipe design, and we worked out in the meal we had about 45 herbs, which we'd picked from outside the door pretty much. So some of those things would be, obviously, yes, it's the parsley, sage, rosemary, thyme. The cistus I've mentioned, it makes a gorgeous tea and really good, full of antioxidants. The myrtle is wonderful. The Hoitonia is wonderful. You will no longer be going out weeding and throwing weeds on the compost heap because you can use your dandelions, your plantains, your daisies. Yarrow is another good one. Clove pink is one of my favorites. The pink flowers are a really good nervine tea. I'm kind of trying to think out into my garden what else we go. Oh, calendulas are just beautiful. And sorry, my brain has seized up after the busy day.
I think you've given us quite a few already. Thanks. Just another question, maybe a bit of a technical one, but it's interesting. Are traditional medicines from other cultures, such as India or Mesoamerica, as effective when they're dried and imported, or does it appear to be more effective when they're picked fresh?
Okay, this is a really good question. There's a big debate in the herbal world whether dried herbs or fresh herbs are better. I mean, obviously, if you're using the herbs immediately, then that freshness is very valuable. You've got a lot more vitamins and enzymes and so on. present in them, but if they're being used to process into things, then a good, well-dried herb is better than a sort of sad, fresh herb that has been allowed to wilt, and so on. The whole question about herbs from different regions, there's the whole sort of availability of them. And I think a lot of regions are beginning to look at actually looking at their local needs a bit more, and looking at how some of the herbs have been picked unsustainably due to sort of pressure, and not picked according to sort of local tradition and so on. So it's a huge area. But when we come back to, are dried herbs less effective? They don't have to be if they're dried well. And that's the main thing, is when they're picked fresh or whether they're dried, it's like making sure they're healthy
Perfect.
to use. Yeah.
Interesting. Just go with one more, because there's quite a few. Just one more. Is it feasible for everyone in Ireland to forage and eat what's growing well? Kind of in a sense, is there a risk of kind of decimating wild areas or causing habitat destruction due to over foraging?
Okay, this is something I feel really passionate about. So it's a great question. It's a great question, because what we have seen is people going into areas to forage for commercial interest, and people who have been sort of foraging in an area going, things are being stripped bare now. So that is different to people kind of doing their local bit of foraging, and foraging as a way of taking care of ecosystems. So one of the things that we encourage our students to do is to maybe grow some of those plants in their gardens, you know, rather than going and stripping or in their community gardens or their allotments, rather than going and stripping say the elder trees and hawthorn trees that obviously the birds and other animals are using too. Why not plant more of these things? And then the same with some of the other plants, like, you know, the wild garlic or whatever it is, rather than going out and foraging in a sort of supermarket mentality of just grab what you want. One, become aware of the ecosystem and what other beings are in that ecosystem. If you are picking and do it as a way of caretaking it. But two, bring more of the wild ones into our gardens. I mean, like, you know, if the nettles show up, don't just rip them out, but trim them and make your pestos, make your soups, and so on. So when you bring in the right attitude, then foraging can actually be a way of looking after ecosystems. But I do agree that we do need to be aware that there are people who are coming back with big sacks of chanterelles or whatever, and that's not okay, you know. So great question.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Nikki. Thanks again for your talk. It was super informative, but we'll have to leave it there. So I'll just pass it to Fuchsia, who will introduce our second speaker. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Fuchsia and I'll be introducing our next guest, Dr. Paul Fitters. We're lucky enough to have him as a lecturer at the College of Amenity Horticulture, National Botanic Gardens. It's a bit of a mouthful. Paul specialises in ecology and nematology, and he'll be giving a talk about rewilding, how it benefits flora and fauna, and what we can do in our gardens to increase biodiversity. So I'm just going to hand it over to Paul now.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, good evening, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to give the talk here. I am going to share my screen. Just to be okay. Can people see this? Okay, so I'm going to go talking about rewilding, and the title, I'll come back to the title at the end, but I call it Dare to be Wild, because the first time I gave this talk, I was in a group a club, and they all had very nice, clean gardens, well maintained, and I dared them effectively to go wild and to be a bit let go effectively. The reason I'm interested in going wild, I've been teaching ecology and teaching biodiversity and those kind of subjects, and organic growing as well at some point, and so I have an interest in those kind of principles. But also I'm a very keen gardener for since I was young. I was gardening, and I'm nearly obsessive gardener, and I'm constantly doing things, moving things, trying things out, and spend a lot of time weeding, including precious weeds that I now know I can use as herbs. And if I go out into the wild, very often I find it extremely calming. And if you go to a forest a bit like here, the tree trunk with moss and ferns and a few flowering plants here and there, it can be very restful. And very often there's not a gardener inside. So for instance, if you go to Glendalough in Wicklow, you can walk around there and there's not really a gardener out there doing anything, and it's lovely. Closer to home, I got myself a doggy. There she is, Lucy, and I let Lucy out in the area. I'm in County Carlow, and the farmer close by allows me to use his land to let the dog out. And he has lovely wild areas with hawthorn and grasses let go. And it's just very, very interesting. And again, there's no gardener inside. And then what's even nicer, oh, here she's jumping again. What's even nicer is currently at the river, which is very close by to our house, we have this massive bluebell area. And there's so many bluebells, you cannot avoid stepping on them. And it's just beautiful, and it will be followed by bracken coming through it, or coming through as we speak. And these areas are just stunning, and again, there's no gardener inside, and they're very good for biodiversity. They're really nice areas with loads of interesting insects. Now, last year, or the year before, I guess by now, I read a book about the Knepp estate in the UK, and this was an estate, like many estates in the UK and around the world maybe, that was passed on from generation to generation, and the owners were struggling to make a living. So they had loads of land, and you might think they're very rich, but every time the land wasn't the best agricultural land, and they kept on putting more and more chemicals in to keep the crops growing, more and more resources, and yet the returns were getting less and less. So in other words, they were beginning to incur losses. In some years they did incur losses, and they had effectively a huge estate, 3,500 acre estate it was, or it still is. And in 2000 they decided to let go, effectively sell off all their cattle, and take away all the fences in the whole estate, and then they released other animals that are more closely related to wild animals. So instead of the normal cattle that they had, they brought in English longhorn cattle, as you can see here, and the background is the castle itself. They brought in loads of deer, different types of deer, and Dartmoor ponies, which are the closest ancestor in the UK for wild horses. And what they did is effectively did nothing. So rather than manipulating the countryside and taking control of everything, they effectively took all the fences out, only had an outside boundary fence, and let the animals effectively create the habitats, create different kind of habitats, and do their own thing. And they also included in their release the pig. This is a Tamsworth pig. Pigs are very important for disturbances, and as you can see here, they dug up the whole front lawn of the estate. But by disturbing it, again creates more habitats for different plants and also different animals. So they're quite essential in a an ecosystem to have animals that disturb as well. The last thing that they introduced, and they only introduced it in 2000, is the otter. And they are of the beaver, sorry, and they are extremely important for creating, making dams and creating, making the rivers change ways and creating wetlands. And again, they are effectively keystone species, as we call them, because they, relative to the number of animals that they are, their impact on the whole environment is out of proportion to the size and the numbers of animals. So they did all that in 2000, and they had a few hiccups and a few problems, but overall it went very well. And what happened is that the whole countryside or their whole estate changed. There were certain areas became forested, other areas became bare, and more variation started to appear. But not only did the animals thrive, and it's interesting if I can relate it back to the previous lecture, the animals effectively were left totally by themselves, so they weren't medicated in any way as normal cattle is, and the animals seemed to remember what they need when they need it. So if they self-medicated on local herbs, so if they needed nettle, they were eating nettle, and if they needed whatever rushes, they were eating rushes, and they seemed to know what they needed, and they didn't need vets, so they were healthy. But the amazing thing in the Knapp estate is that there was effectively a whole cascade of events happening. So for instance, the nightingale started to appear and have now loads of nesting couples in the estate, and it's singing away, obviously, and the estate itself has 1% of the total nightingale population of the whole of the UK. So that's quite enormous for a relatively small patch of land. They found the emperor, the purple emperor butterfly, which is a very rare butterfly. I've never seen it in Ireland anyway, but that butterfly is also massive amount of numbers in the estate. And then finally they have the turtle dove, which we all probably know from Christmas, but very few people have seen it because there aren't many around. It's very elusive, and the turtle dove is doing very well in the estate. I just took out a few examples of animals that were doing well. The animals, the big deer were doing very well as well, or the big herd animals. But on top of that, loads of insects did very well. So for instance, in the dung of the cattle, because they weren't treated with chemicals, you have loads of dung beetles in them, and that's an indicator again of biodiversity. And what they said in the Knapp estate, and you can see the link here if you want to see a video, is that it was beyond their imagination how nature was able to bounce back. And it's just by letting go. And effectively what they said, it was a tropic cascade. So by doing nothing and introducing all these wild animals and and then letting things happen, it gave far more biodiversity than they ever imagined. And this rewilding process is effectively something that is happening in many places in the world. It's not something necessarily new, but Knapp is a very good example of it. And the thinking now is that if we want to get biodiversity, it's better to rewild big areas and let nature do it themselves, rather than preserving one area for one species or trying to keep it the same all the time so that that one species will thrive. It could be a rare species. What they found is by just letting nature take control itself, the species will come and will build up, and it's a much better way of preserving. Now, to have biodiversity is important, and to have places like Knapp is important. But what they say as well is you need not only big areas like this. I can't find a word now. Anyway, you also need corridors. You need connections between those big areas, the core areas. You need corridors that connect them to other areas so that animals like the turtle dove and the nightingale can go from one big core area to another area. The last thing that you need for a proper rewilding project is carnivores. And that's the one thing that's missing in NEP. There aren't any wolves, there aren't any bears, there aren't any big carnivores that will take out the cattle. But what they've done in NEP is they turned it around and they are now selling the meat as organic meat, wild meat, and making much better money than they did when they were growing normal, conventional cattle. And also they're doing lots of safaris, and they have a whole industry now for tourists to visit the estate. So in other words, they really turned it around and in the process helped nature enormously. What they also found was that their expectation was too low. And so when they started the project, they didn't expect it to be as successful as it is, and they didn't expect to see so many animals coming back. And that refers back to what is called the shifting baseline syndrome. And it means it comes down to the fact that with every generation, the baseline of what you think is normal is slightly less than the previous generation. So in the 1800s, you might have had a huge number of animals in the sea, and the fishermen would know that there are loads of variation in the sea. But 3 generations later, there is far less fish in the sea. But for those people, that generation, they think that's normal. And with each shifting generation, with each going generation, the expectation of what is normal shifts and effectively decreases. So we are now having far less expectations of nature, and we need to increase our expectations to go back to real biodiversity rather than going back to what we used to know 10 years ago. A good image for that to me, to bring it home, is that in 2000, people who had a driving license and were driving around, when they were driving around, there were lots of insects on your windscreen, and that could be very irritating. So you need to put in nice weather, you need to put the windscreen wipers on and spray all the time. While in 2020, you do not. And so, for instance, my kids might find this their baseline, while for me, this is the baseline. Yeah, so I know how many insects are gone, but my kids mightn't know it because they've always had clean windscreens when they were driving, or when they were being driven, I guess. And so the people in NEP found out that there was definitely a shifting baseline syndrome happening with them. And they want now to go back to expecting more from biodiversity. Now, the question is, of course, what can you do? Yeah, what can we do? We don't, most of us anyway, don't have 3,500 acres of land to let go wild. We might have a garden, sometimes even a big garden, but most people have a garden like this, or you might not even have a garden. And so you wonder, yeah, fine, rewilding, what can I do? But the thing is, I think everybody can do something. And even this garden, although it's very neat and the grass doesn't seem to have many weeds and there's only a box hedge that's tightly clipped, but yet there is a pond, yet there is a hedge. So there is still some biodiversity value in it, and there is a tree. So every garden adds something to it. And if we then add the gardens together, we effectively are creating corridors. So that's the second part of rewilding of Ireland. Those gardens are important to connect the core areas, so the, say, Phoenix Park, with Wicklow, or in the case of NEP, the NEP estate, to other parks in the UK. So our gardens, no matter how small, are valuable as corridors for certain animals. And the tree I put up here a few years ago, it was a big deal for the bus corridors, to trying to create bus corridors, but in the process take loads of trees away. And I thought that was really bad, because these are, again, biodiversity hotspots in the city, and again can be used as a corridor for loads of animals. So comes back to the second part of the talk, is effectively what can you do as a horticulturalist, or as just a person with a garden, or even with a few window boxes. It doesn't matter what you have, everybody can do something. And there's whole rakes of things you can do, and I'm just going to go through a few of them to hopefully stimulate you to do a bit more for nature to increase biodiversity. So the first thing is have loads of flowering plants for the bees. We all know that that there is a problem with pollinators, that there's less and less flowers, and so having simple flowers, so not double roses and double everything, because there's not much nectar in it for the bees. But if you have basic flowers, then there is nectar and pollen in for the bees. And the idea is that you should, or if you could, have nectar sources all year round. So, okay, oilseed rape is not a garden plant that you would grow, but dandelions are not only good for preventing cancer, I just learned, but they're also good for the bees, and they're an early crop, an early plant, and as a result of it, it's important for bees to have a source of nectar early in the year. Also, it's good to have a flowering tree like a sycamore, because compared to garden plants that you might have, they're very tiny very often, and while one tree can make a huge difference for many, many bees. Clover is always good, lime, it's another tree, etc. Willow herb was mentioned this morning as well. We can make tea from it, and then finally heather flowers very late. Yeah, so it's good to have a different source of nectar, having flowers all year round. And ivy, again, is also a very good plant. There are lots of bees in Ireland. We have about 100 different bees. One is the honeybee, and then we have loads of solitary bees, like the leaf cutter bee here. So again, if I see my roses being cut, they love roses. I think that's a nice sign. I know it's damaged, but I like it because I know they're somewhere. We have about 30 bumblebees. Again, I will talk about my Wildflower Meadow in a minute. I have loads of different bumblebees. I still don't know them all, but they are very interesting, and there's loads of variety as well. And I've even found nests in my Wildflower Meadow of bumblebees like this one. And then there's also the carder bees that go into masonry bees that go into hollows in old walls. So not only can you grow more plants for the bees, another thing you can do is not be so tidy. And that's difficult sometimes for gardeners. So if a tree dies, why take it away? It's a source for a lot of animals and fungi to break it down slowly, and that will cascade into other biodiversity. Now, not everybody would like to leave a tree like this in their garden because it looks a bit unsightly, but you could grow a rose over it and it can still rot away slowly but surely. Alternatively, you chop it up and you use the wood locally to make your own raised beds. Much better than getting expensive stone from Italy or whatever to be very fancy. This is much more habitats for biodiversity. And then you can make a stumpery as well, very old-fashioned in big estates. Have a shaded area where you put all the stumps and grow loads of ferns on it. And then also you can, if you have a tree trunk and the tree itself is gone, you might make a little house for gnomes and other things. What I did in my own garden, I had an archway from my predecessor, which I bought the house from, and the top fell off, and I used loads of leftover wood from pruning down trees to make the arch, and it works very well. Now I have to say it looks spectacular the first year, and then it gets a bit dark and a bit dull after a while. But again, it's just using locally, and it's creating habitats again for loads of insects. I found this tree on the internet. Somebody, instead of chopping it down for wood, they made a very creative painting out of it almost, and let nature do the rest over time. Then I come to my Wildflower Meadow. One of the easy things that most people can do if you have grass is just let go. Yeah, just not cut it. I have an acre of land. I feel very lucky, and I've given 2/3 over effectively to more or less nature. So close to the house, it's gardening, because I am a horticulturalist and I can't stop myself trying all the plants that I can get my hands on. But it's too big to maintain intensely, and the lower part of the 1 acre I let go. So it's lots of shrubs, and then the middle bit is Wildflower Meadow. Now, in order to feel in control, I cut paths through it. It means I can access the meadow, and also it means it looks like I'm in control, and it's quite nice. This is the meadow, I think a few years ago, probably mid-June, when all the oxeye daisies are coming out, and it looks very nice. I went out this morning. This is what it looks like this morning. At the moment, it's just about to come on. There's lots of veronica out there. There is lots of buttercups here on the slightly damper side, and this is towards the arch. You might just see it there, and towards the house. And then if you look the other way, I have another path going down, and that goes to my little area with trees. The Wildflower Meadow, I think, is very exciting, because I have loads of different plants. Every year I find new plants that I didn't have the year before. Something will appear all the time. It's changing all the time as well. It's getting poorer every year, because I cut it once a year and I take the grass away. So when I cut the meadow in September, I dry it, let the seed fall off, and then I put the remains in between the trees. So every year the soil gets a bit poorer, and as a result, every year I get more and more flowers. So it's working really well. I really like it. I put the paths, by the way, different every year. That has an effect in its own right, because very often next year you see loads of oxeye daisies where I had the path this year. So there's all kinds of reactions happening, how plants react. And then at the end of the year, generally in September, I cut the grass. I've got a scythe mower. It's effectively a big hedge trimmer on the ground. This is my nephew Marijn. If I have my own kids or my brother's kids over, I try to use them. And this guy really loved big machinery. So we cut the grass, we let it sit for a bit to dry up, and then we try to make a haystack, which is great fun, especially with kids. If you do a bit of competition, who makes the biggest one, it does wonders to making them work. So that was good fun. And then once the hay is gone, or once the trees are bare, I put it underneath the trees as a mulch. So Wildflower Meadows to me is an easy thing to do. My mother-in-law in Ireland has decided, after seeing it talk as well, to let the meadow, her lawn, go. Not all the family members are happy with it, but I think it's brilliant. Okay, another thing you can do is have a pond. Ponds are also magnets for wildlife, insects, birds. Oh, 1 sec. That's not what you meant to happen when you're giving a talk. I'm sorry about that. So this is the pond in France. This is Giverny, if I pronounce it right, Monet garden in France, and he has a massive pond, and he made lovely paintings from his pond, and you can see the paintings in this image already. I went to his garden, which was fantastic, and it was amazingly busy. It is a very popular spot for tourists. But if you go to the pond, everybody is walking around behind a screen of greenery, and so when you look towards the pond, you hardly see any people. It's quite amazing that they managed to get so many people in without seeing it. Need to say this is a wonderful pond, but you mightn't be able to have such a big pond. I put a pond into my garden as well. Here it is. It's a bit hidden, you don't really see it. But again, putting a pond in creates a habitat for, again, a lot of animals. It creates water for animals to drink. And within minutes of putting the water in the pond, I had damselflies arriving and birds drinking. I have loads of frogs. Yeah, it's just heaving with life. It's a fantastic way of increasing biodiversity. And if you don't have a big space, you can have a small pond and that can be just as nice. Yeah, so this is a small pond with a lovely pebble beach where animals can then crawl out onto land. It's always good to have it a shallow area on one side. For instance, once I put a round pond into my garden that was in Dublin then, and I didn't have a place to get out, and a hedgehog went in and didn't come out. So you need to have kind of a way, an escape route for animals to get out. Now, there's loads of things you can do to increase biodiversity. I just shown you a few. Nest boxes for birds would be good. Growing sunflowers or other tall plants like teasels for birds to eat the seeds. And bat boxes is another good one that you can do to increase biodiversity. I made a few bat boxes myself, not as fancy as this one. And the bats do come. It's amazing. What you don't do really is use chemicals. Especially in a garden situation, it's totally not needed, especially if you now start growing herbs, as you just heard before. You definitely don't want to eat sprayed herbs, but also you want the herbs to grow and all the weeds to grow to eat. Invasive plants is another potential problem, like Rhododendron ponticum on the top right and Japanese knotweed on the bottom. Those plants tend to be monocultures, tend not to have a lot of tolerate a lot of insects, so it's not a habitat for many insects, and it becomes a monoculture, and it's not really good. So those kind of plants you do need to control, and it might be difficult to control them nationwide, but in your own garden, you're well able to control those kind of plants. So there you go. And here is my doggy again, Lucy. When I started off saying that you can do little things in your garden, but you mightn't be able to have Dartmoor ponies or whatever to let things go wild. I have my little pig here. She digs up her bones and puts them somewhere and then pulls them out and puts them somewhere else again. And again, she is doing the work of the pig, I guess, in the big estates, creating new habitats and creating new options. I think the other pig in my acre is me, because I'm constantly gardening too and pulling up plants and moving them. And between all of us, it's quite a diverse place, and it's quite interesting to walk around to see what's happening effectively. So it's quite nice. I want to finish with the Ark. Mary Reynolds, the woman you can see here in the picture, I don't know if you know her, but she is a Irish garden designer, and she went to Chelsea as a rookie, as a 17 or 18-year-old, I don't know how young she was, and she won gold. And she had a wild garden, effectively, quite unusual at that time to have a garden with just native plants and very Celtic design as well. So she became famous for it. And about her journey to Chelsea and winning, a film is made, and the film is called Dare to be Wild. So that's where I stole the title from, just to be clear on it. What Mary is doing at the moment is she has set up an organization called the ARC, and the ARC stands for Acts of Restorative Kindness. And really what they're saying is that, effectively in line with what I said, you should value your little garden because you're part of a corridor. And if we all connect all the corridors together, we can create a massive space for biodiversity to thrive. And her line is become guardians rather than gardeners. Now that would be going a bit against my ethos. I can't help myself gardening, but you can let go of some parts of your garden and let nature take control, and you can still be a gardener somewhere else. That's what I think. And also the college still wants to have students to learn how to garden. But I would say we all have to be a bit less controlly, a bit less chemicals, and let nature take a bit more control. Mary goes quite far to say that she even wants holes in the hedges that animals can move on. I don't really like it because then my dog will escape. And she also mentioned that you shouldn't have too many bright lights on outside in your gardens because that disturbs all the night animals like the moth and all kinds of other animals. And she suggests red lights that's much more softer. Anyway, go to the website. Here's the website, wearetheark.org, and you can read more about it yourself. So really, I think, and it's happening already, we need to change our perception of what is beautiful. For instance, when I started horticulture and gardening, dandelions are a scourge of my life because they're difficult to get out. They always leave a little bit of root behind, and so they are really a pain. But now, since I'm more biodiversity inclined, and when I teach beekeeping, I think dandelions are quite useful. And in the wildflower area, in the Wildflower Meadow, they are quite stunning. So I'm far more tolerable of dandelions than I used to be. It's a change of perception of what is nice and what is looking good. This is what they look like when they're producing the lovely seed heads. There was a question on the questions line or the chat line this morning of somebody can they give references, and I was lucky I had them in already. The book Wilding is written by Isabella Tree. This is about the Napa State, and it's a fantastic read, not only about themselves but also about ecology in general. So how things behave, how other people have done it. There's lots of references to other estates as well, and it's a really interesting read. The other read I find interesting is Bequest from Dave Golson. He is a lecturer in the UK on bumblebees mainly, and he talks about his life doing research on bumblebees and all the kind of funny stories he has, and it's very, very interesting to read and very entertaining, and yet also very, very good. Lots of actual knowledge and good insights in how ecology works. And then there's also here a website for interesting. So that's, I think, where I leave it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. It was an absolutely fantastic talk, and I think we're all so jealous of your beautiful wildflower meadow and your pup and your lovely puppy as well. We had many questions come in there, and I'm just going to take two. Peter asked, one big issue for local authorities in wild meadow creation is how grass is dealt with in September, and he was wondering, do you have any suggestions on tackling this issue?
So is the questions how to deal with grass specifically in wildflower meadows?
Mm-hmm. He mentioned farmers in particular, how it kind of turns farmers away from creating wildflower meadows.
Okay. It's a good question. It was a difficult question. Well, farmers now can get money to leave a strip bare at the edge of their field to grow wildflowers, and from Gloss, I think they get money to do that. So that would be one way. I'm not 100% sure if I get the question. Yeah, I find in my meadow, grass was a problem in the beginning when it was too rich, but over time I harvested the whatever grew and put it away. So every year I made it a bit poorer, and as a result, grass get less competitive compared to other flowering plants, and I got more and more flowers. And finally, I introduced yellow rattle, which is a parasite of grass, and it's an annual weed, and that makes grass weaker again. And I think that could be the solution in a wildflower meadow, to have grass be less dominant. I don't think that's a risk for farmers because it's an annual. So if you mow over it twice, it's gone. It's not a threat for farmers. So I hope I answered the questions.
Absolutely, perfect. And Margie was wondering, does cutting the meadow affect the bumblebee nesting in the ground?
Yeah, it depends when you cut your meadow, and if they're finished producing the young queens, because at the end of the season they produce queens and they go and find a new nest to start a new colony next year. So if there's bumblebee nest in your meadow and you're aware of it, then you should not mow it until they're finished. I don't have a date when they're finished. Most of the time bumblebee nests are in hedgerows and quite hidden, because I only found one once in my meadow. They're mainly in the hedgerows that you don't really see them. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you very much. And I'm going to leave it open now to the next group to introduce their speaker.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Paul. That was very interesting. Hi, everyone. Tonight, our third speaker tonight, and our final speaker will be Cormac Downey, who is a tree specialist with the Office of Public Works, and he's going to talk to us about veteran trees. If you have any questions, just drop them into the Q&A down the bottom. Cormac?
Okay, lovely. That's great. Eric, thanks very much. First of all, thanks very much for the invitation to speak this evening. We'll start this. My name is Cormac Downey, and I'm the Arboricultural Officer for the OPW. I've worked with trees, so all my work in life. I used to climb, had my own tree surgery company. So over the years, I've collected lots of pictures and have had a huge interest in particularly old trees and what we now term as veteran trees. So my talk tonight is primarily on veteran trees, and I will use a lot of pictures, and I suppose it's a casual walk through veteran trees. I'll also mention the other classification of trees that we use. So I suppose what is a veteran tree? A veteran tree, I suppose it's easy to recognize, but hard to define. These terms are very subjective, I suppose. But for a veteran tree, it's a tree that shows ancient characteristics, which not just due to age, but can result from natural damage, management, or the tree's environment. So what are these characteristics? Major cavities or progressive hollowing, that's particularly in the main stem, which is quite important. We have naturally forming water pools, decay holes, physical damage to the trunk, large quantity of dead wood within the canopy, with sap runs, crevices in the bark, under branches, or on the root plate, sheltered from direct rainfall. So that's quite specific. With fungal fruiting bodies from hard-rotting species, epiphytic plants, and of course, just high aesthetic interest. And here's a picture. These are two beech trees which had their heads chopped off by a storm. But previous to that storm, I would not have termed these as veteran, but afterwards, most definitely veteran, as this habitat has been suddenly created. That central core of the main stem has been exposed. This creates fantastic habitat. But these trees are still going at the moment. They're still okay, and luckily they're in an area where we can manage. The people. It's not used that much, so these trees don't, I suppose, pose a terrific risk to people. So they can be kept and managed for the habitat that they provide. We talk about definitions. The definition we use in the OPW, and I've added heritage trees to this because we deal with also, a lot of different types of trees. So a veteran heritage tree, trees that by recognized criteria show features of biological, cultural, or aesthetic value that are characteristic of, but not exclusive to, individuals surviving beyond the typical age range for species concerned. So ancient trees would be veterans, but not all veterans are ancient trees. But we need to understand that the majority of trees have an indeterminate or indefinite growth pattern, and are not limited in its shape, size, or theoretically to an ultimate age, but are governed by their site, environmental conditions, and their past management. So trees can, as you know, produce new shoots, roots, and radial increments of wood and bark throughout their lives. So trees can continually reinvent themselves. So they don't really have a fixed lifespan. And I suppose we need to get that picture out of our heads, because a lot of people just see trees as, they're young, middle-aged, they're old, and they die. But that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. So, we have to, I suppose, change our perspective, and try to appreciate that all these life stages, there are old life stages, but there are many stages of the later life of a tree. And just to illustrate that, these fantastic set of photographs, you see that this is an oak tree, and you see in 1910, obviously, the side branches were either removed for whatever reason, or there was some damage done to the roots. And as you go into the 20s, you can see the top of that crown started to thin out a lot. And in 1950, you can see it has totally died back or retrenched, and the stem has started to throw out new growth. And as you move through the years up to 2010, you have this tree which has totally retrenched and reinvented itself, and so it can perpetuate itself and keep going. So a veteran tree, not to be confused with an ancient tree, and these two terms, as they do get thrown around a bit, it can get a bit confusing. But an ancient tree, I suppose, is easier to recognize or to define. Ancient trees are those which have reached a great age in comparison with others of the same species. But generally, these trees are low, fat, have a squat shape, because the crown is retrenched in size through age, a wide trunk compared with others of the same species, and a hollowing of the trunk not always visible. But that hollowing trunk is, I would say, always a characteristic of a veteran tree, of an ancient tree. This is a picture of an ancient tree. This is one of what used to be 4 yew trees. So this is in Cumbria, in a place called Barradale in the lakes up in Cumbria. Those 4 yew trees are made famous by William Wordsworth, who penned the poem The Fraternal Four. But there are only 3 now. One was lost. But this one, and just to give a perspective on the size, if you can see that black thing there on the main stem, that's my cap. And I placed that at my 6 foot. So that's where I would be standing. That's where my head would be, just to give a perspective on the size of that tree. It's absolutely massive. But if you notice that wood on that side of the stem is dead, it's dysfunctional. But if you see the growth, the vigorous growth on that tree, it's quite spectacular, actually. And there's been DNA testing carried out on on a limb that had fallen off. I think you just see that here in the foreground. And first of all, that limb, the ring count of that limb was, I believe, over 2,000. and that's on one limb of the tree. But what was even more interesting was this DNA testing that they found, that the DNA was identical to the 3 other trees that remain, which would suggest that this originally, going back, was one tree, which blows my mind, I have to say. So this is a sweet chestnut in Castletown in Kildare. Is one of our sites. I would consider this possibly an ancient tree. It's got all the characteristics of an ancient tree. It's quite squat, and you can see on the right hand side where we have put in a prop just to support a dying limb, which I think is actually dead, but there's fantastic habitat within that limb. And of course, there's mulch around the base of the tree, which is quite important when it comes to managing trees, particularly older trees. The heritage and notable trees, we have, I suppose, 5 characteristics, characterizations of trees. We would, on top of the ancient and the veteran, we will have heritage notable trees. But these are trees connected with specific historic events or people, well-known landmarks in their community, a tree with significant landscape character or architectural setting. And as an example of that would be this magnolia. Again, this is in Cumbria. I had the good fortune to work on this estate. This is Muncaster Castle in Western Cumbria, a gorgeous place. But this is a Magnolia isca, and this was produced by the Vetch nurseries, and there's only one of 2 magnolias remaining from a breeding program he put together. But that itself would make it a heritage tree. But the flowering, and this was early in the spring, very early. It's absolutely amazing flowers. But the size of this tree, again, my hat, I have a lot of hats, but that's 6 foot, and that's the size of that stem. So anyone familiar with magnolias will appreciate the size of that tree. It's an absolutely stunning tree. And again, I'll put this picture, and these are 2 tulip trees. I believe these are champion trees, but you can see people beside it just to show you the scale of these trees. But these are champion, I believe, for their height. These are well over 100 foot in height, but amazing trees. And I've thrown this one in. I don't know if anyone would recognize what tree that is, but it's a much maligned tree, unfortunately. But that's a Sitka spruce. But it's a Sitka spruce, of course, that's been let grow, and it hasn't been harvested at 35, 45 years. But again, it just shows what trees can become when they're left alone. And I suppose it feeds into a lot of what Paul was talking about in his previous talk, the kind of ethos that, less is more. You leave nature to itself, to its own devices, and it does what it's supposed to do, and it creates all beautiful environments, great habitats. Again, this is a sycamore. This is in Dublin. I put this in. This is in Arbor Hill. It's just a sycamore. Again, a much maligned tree, and I'm glad to hear Paul mention the sycamore in his talk too. One of my favorite trees, actually. Many consider it a weed, but I think sycamores in maturity particularly are fantastic trees. But this tree I put in because of where it is. This tree would have, I suppose, witnessed the burial of the leaders in 1916 Rising. Another interesting tree I've added. This is a lime tree that was a silver lime was grafted onto a common lime originally, and the graft has come up and tried to take over. So what we have here are two lime trees in one. which is very strange to look at when the sun shines and that silver leaf on the right hand side shimmers a little, but very interesting. And I would say actually, that's in a graveyard. The graveyards are fantastic places if you're ever traveling around home or abroad to look for trees, because you find all sorts of weird and wonderful trees in graveyards. So I'd keep that in mind on your travels. Of course, I threw this one in just because of, I suppose, what time of year it is. It's the iconic tree of the Phoenix Park for me, the hawthorn, fantastic tree for wildlife, and of course it's in its prime at the moment. This is a Cork Oak. I put this in just purely because of its size. It's very hard to show what this tree is like in photographs. You really, like most things, you really have to be there just to appreciate the size and the texture of this tree. But it's a fantastic tree. And it just, again, it goes to show it's not a tree you would associate with this side of Europe at all, really. But it can grow well here. I've seen a few in Ireland, but none of this size. A really beautiful tree. This is actually down in Devon in England. And I suppose the climate then is a bit more suitable for it. But I've seen many of these trees here in Ireland, but as I say, nothing like this size. This one, now this tree is in Ireland. This is a beech tree up in Glebe Gallery up in Donegal, another one of our sites, OPW sites. And I put this in really just to, I suppose, show. I would consider this a tree with arboricultural heritage. You see the bricked up cavity there, which harks back to, and not very long ago, how people would have managed cavities in trees, and they would have seen it as a structural defect, and so obviously would have applied a structural solution to it and bricked it up. This, of course, doesn't really help the tree, to be honest. But I don't know if it harms it either. But it's just, as I say, it's of interest, and it's a bit of arboricultural heritage for me, and it's a great talking point, and people visiting that site are always drawn to it. So why are veteran trees important? Well, for landscape value, this is an oak tree which many people would walk by and not give a second glance to. But what we have here is, the heartwood of that tree is gone. It's decomposing as we speak, and you can see all that litter in the base of the tree. But of course, that's nutrients, and this nutrient recycling is a huge part of veteran and ancient trees. But I'll touch a bit more. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But from the landscape point of view, that's it. From a different angle, I suppose. But it just goes to show it has a little, tree stump like that does have a lot to offer landscape aesthetically wise, I suppose. Veteran trees can also be a link to our past and our heritage. Again, a sycamore. As I said, I do like sycamores, especially when they get a bit older. This is in Farmley, as I say, and it's an absolutely gorgeous tree. And this is on the way. You would pass this if you parked up in the main car park and walked towards the house. And every kid, myself included, it's very hard not to want to climb that or get up on it or interact with it, which is great. It has its problems, of course, with compaction and such, but it's great to see people interact with trees. I think it's really important. But it is a gorgeous tree. And again, you really need to see that in the flesh, as it were, to appreciate it. So there are living ecosystems above and below ground, and that's quite important to appreciate, that there is as much, if not more, going on below ground than there is above ground. They are rare and getting more rare. We are losing genetic information. There's that oak on the left. You see the size of that tree. just I put that in as an example, maybe for for timber production to propagate from that tree. You kind of you know what you're going to get in a way. The picture on the right, an ash tree, absolutely massive ash tree. How old it is, we don't know, but it goes back many generations. So if you think of the genetic information that's in that it would have received from its predecessors that would have gone before, millennia before it, what secrets that hold possibly may help with dealing with climate change, dealing with ash dieback possibly. So it's a huge, these trees are a huge well of information, and that shouldn't be forgotten. So bigger trees are getting more rare, particularly in urban situations, and for lots of reasons. Some reasons are due to people afraid of risk, lack of understanding, I suppose. But it's these older trees that provide these niche and specialized habitats. So, the less older trees there are, the less habitats we have. And it's an important point, I suppose, because what we want to avoid is something I think they call extinction debt, where you would have a tree like that one in I'm showing there, where it may be absolutely swarming with biodiversity, different insects, all sorts of things, but that's probably only because there is nowhere else for them to go. So this tree might be really rich in biodiversity, but it has nowhere to migrate to, which is a real problem, and it's one of the important areas of managing veteran trees or older trees. And we're always looking for a good range of species and a good age range. So we want young trees coming on, and you see that picture, I put it in there because there are young trees planted, but there's a big gap between those young trees and those older trees, and it's that middle gap that's the next generation that will get older and decay and get more veterinized, and will allow all these specialized species to migrate and move around. So that's quite an important point. Of course, habitats, they provide great habitat to the obvious nesting, hiding and feeding of vertebrates and invertebrates, niche habitats, deadwood or decaying wood. Deadwood is a very negative term. I think, again, it's a cultural thing. We need to look at deadwood as, it's a positive thing. Deadwood is sometimes more alive than live wood. It supports so many different insects. Specialized insect larvae need wood in an advanced state of decay to feed on. So that's saprozoic invertebrates, and as I said, that just means insects that are invertebrates that require dead wood in their life pattern. So 11% of European saprozoic beetles are threatened. They're the most threatened species community in Europe, which is frightening. And it just illustrates, I suppose, the lack of habitat. So we protect the species, of course. We have the bat. I put this picture in. This is a defect in a tree. Again, we have to look at it, change our perspective slightly. You look at that tree, it's a risk. There's a defect there. It might fail, might injure someone. But defects, and I would suggest that all defects provide habitat. So it's just something to keep in mind. That's a very obvious place. It's a potential bat roost for one. So again, it's just important to keep that in mind. These two pictures of two oaks, lightning strikes, have caused these to these two massive wounds on their stem, but terrific for habitat. It's exposed their heartwood, it's exposed the inside of the tree, which lets insects in, and it also can kick in latent decay, which would be fungal spores that were already within the tree's system, but they were just waiting for for oxygen, basically, to kick them into life, which is quite amazing when you think of it. But so, you know, these trees are ecosystems in themselves. There's all sorts of things going on all the time, and it's constantly changing, and new niche habitats are being created all the time. So again, it's just to show that these defects are habitat, and where you can, they should be kept and managed. And I just hark back to a point that Paul made. Sometimes less is more. All you want to do is give nature a chance to do its thing, and try not to interfere too much, which can be difficult when managing trees, particularly in a public park, because safety, of course, has a huge implication on tree management. But you know, there are certain ways around that at times, depending on the situation. So we have epiphytes as well. You know, these older trees are great habitats for epiphytes, which in itself can be quite attractive, I think. So I think that's for those horticulturists out there. I think it's polypodium, I think, Fern. And just speaking of epiphytes, I think this is the greatest example of one. This again is in Cumbria. And Cumbria is very wet. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but it's very, very wet. And in these woodlands, we have these moss-covered stems, and often seeds get dropped by birds on this wet moss, and they can germinate. And it's that wet that the roots can survive and live, and they will drop down through the moss and make contact with the ground eventually, and can grow on its own. And they basically just piggyback on these trees. So it just goes to show where trees can survive. I thought that's very interesting when I saw that first. Now, decaying wood as a dead wood, very important when it comes to veteran tree management, or tree management, any management, which will be touched on for the two previous speakers. Really, really important. And aesthetically, I think personally, in the right place, very, very pleasing, I have to say. This is a sweet chestnut in the Phoenix Park. This, because of where it is, this can be retained in the state it is in, which I think is fantastic. It again provides all sorts of habitat there, but looks again, very natural as well, which is important. This is an oak, dead, obviously. This is in Dandelion down in Kerry, and again, I think it looks very natural. It's been kept there. Plants start to use it for support, and it grows on it. But again, aesthetically very pleasing and very natural looking. Now we go on to heartwood. This wound on this main limb on this oak. What's happened here is it's created an avenue for insects to get inside the center of that tree. So it's a bit of a gateway into the main stem of that tree for specialized insects, and particularly decay fungi, because the heartwood of an oak, is quite hard to decay. So there's a very few specialized fungi that can take advantage of it. So again, we're shrinking down to a very, very specific niche habitat. And again, it just feeds into the idea that this is getting more and more rare. And deadwood on its own, this is through this picture because this is a tree that was dead near a busy path. So it's, for safety reasons, it was taken down, but it was left. No need to remove it. And as a happy kind of result of just leaving it there, I mean, you can see all the porcelain fungus growing on that, which is in itself aesthetically pleasing. But what it's done here is create a bit of a nursery. You can see, this rowan being able to germinate and being protected from the deer herd that's in the park, because any tree that's planted in the park will need to be fenced off, because the deers will absolutely destroy it. So here's a bit of natural fencing, if you like. The tree has got up to that height on its own without being browsed, which is great. So it's got a real good chance of actually going on and becoming a full tree. Again, deadwood in the landscape. This is one of my favorite parts of the park. And this big oak tree you see in the center, again, it can be kept because this is not a very heavily used area, but a fantastic perch for any owls possibly hunting in that long grass that you see below it. And it has that connection to the woodland behind it. But again, a very natural and very nice picture, really. It's just very natural, the landscape. Now we have sap runs, slime fluxes, great source of sugar, as you can see here on the right. I could get nice up and close to the mostly wasps, I have to say, but they weren't really bothered with me when I was there. They were getting nicely tipsy, I think, on what was coming out of that tree. But again, it just goes to show the insect life that can live off this tree. This was crawling with all sorts of little things, which in turn draws in predators, birds, all sorts. So plants and fungi have evolved and worked together for the last 400 million years and have formed intimate relationships with each other. And fungi are an essential part of the tree's ecosystem as decomposers, breaking down dead and decaying material, nutrient gatherers, and mycorrhizal fungi, hugely important. Fungi create conditions where saprozoic invertebrates thrive. These, as I mentioned before, are the most threatened community of invertebrates in Europe. So I'm just going to show a couple of pictures of some fungi. This is the beefsteak Fistulina hepatica. It creates a brown rot. This is a specialized heart decay fungi. This was taken in the Phoenix Park as well. Gorgeous fungal bracket, I have to say. I think all fungal brackets at the different stages of the life are for me really, really attractive. But this is the same one, and to the right you see an older one. So you can see them at the different life stages. They look, of course, totally different. And this picture of brown cubicle rot. And this is where this will be caused by the Fistulina, the beefsteak fungus, and many other different brown rot fungi. And what happens here is the cellulose is degraded and it leaves the lignin, and it leaves this kind of crack pattern. And the maize-gill Phaeolus schwannitzii, gorgeous bracket again, very common on conifers. You can find these very far from the tree. They can grow on the roots many, many meters away from the tree. And of course, this is the chicken of the woods, Laetoporus sulphureus. Gorgeous, particularly when it's young, is a gorgeous fungal bracket. Edible as well, hence its name, chicken of the woods. This is Pseudoinonotus striatus, and this can cause what they refer to as an Eiffel Tower decay, which basically means the main structural roots of the tree kind of remain, and all the rest of the lower trunk is decayed. So the tree is kind of basically on these stilts. But this is called guttation. These little droplets of water. Again, it can be very attractive. That's a close up of it. There's lots of fungal fungi do this. And of course, the giant polypore, this Myripelis giganteus. Now this can be quite destructive on beech trees, depending on the beech tree's condition. It's not always, but it's not a great one to have, especially in a heavily used area. But I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean the beech trees will collapse because of it, but it's certainly one to look out for. And this causes a white rot as opposed to the brown rot. And the white rot, the timber ends up looking like this, which is really squishy, and it can be quite wet. It's like a sponge, basically. And it's more or less does the opposite to the brown rot, where the lignin is degraded and the cellulose is left. So as I said, fungi, an essential component of the nutrient cycle. So wood is equals energy. So how do the trees take advantage of this energy? They produce these aerial roots, and they can produce these and to drop them down, and they more or less grow back into the center of the tree where the decay is happening, to try and recycle the nutrients of itself, basically. And this is the sweet chestnuts that I showed you earlier in Castletown, and a great example of an aerial root there. And again, it just shows how attractive that actual tree is. It's full of character, that tree. And this is a birch tree. Again, you see aerial roots on the inside. It's rare enough to get birch trees, particularly in built-up areas, of any great age, and they're not a very long-lived tree as such. But you can see, this birch trees, along with most other trees, can produce these aerial roots and try and reinvent themselves. This is a beech tree. This tree this is in the Phoenix Park, and this has been pruned a couple of times, and it's been managed because this central stem is completely hollow. But you can see again on the right hand side there, aerial roots being produced, and that tree is doing fine. It was reduced in order to, I suppose, manage the structural integrity, if you like, of the tree. And from an engineering point of view, it's basically to remove the end weight of the tree, and that's in order to stop it from, I suppose, catastrophic collapse, where if you had a heavy weight on the ends of a tree and it falls apart onto a hollow stem, that that tree would not survive, particularly a beech tree. It will die, I suppose, over a number of years relatively quickly. So we carry out these operations to try and retain the tree in as best condition for as long as possible.
Cormac, if I could just come in there, it's my job to wrap up in the next few minutes. If anybody's any questions, put them into the Q&A. We're going to try and wrap up in the next 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, John, thanks. Okay. Okay, other natural strategies, do this really quick. We've coppicing, basically. These trees can produce epicormic shoots. This is a sweet chestnut, absolutely massive tree. You can see it produce a ring of these epicormic growth. And that's a picture of the tree from far away. I'll just show you the size. And to go back to the Castletown tree, you can see these epicormic shoots have grown into larger stems slightly further away from the tree. So these trees can, over time, slowly walk away from themselves. Phoenix regeneration speaks for itself, really. This yew tree, starting after it fell over, starts again. And this is a great picture of what I would refer to as a walking tree. This is a yew tree in Oris nucleron. You can see how much that has moved from its original place. Layering, great picture. This is in Kilkenny Castle. You can see this umbilical cord of a branch that touched the ground for this horse chestnut and has taken off again, just as big as the mother tree. This is a lime tree in an 18th century avenue. You can see that is a catastrophic failure of that tree at one stage, where it has produced all these epicormic shoots which have grown into smaller stems. And the far side of that tree, the center of it's totally gone. It is divided into two separate trees at this stage, and you can see the aerial roots again at the base. So that tree again has moved away from its original position. That's a picture of the aerial roots. And this just goes to show how a tree can divide into different sections over age, and over time, these different sections will become separate trees in their own right. So if one part of that tree fails, there will be a surviving part of that tree to go on. Now, some of the problems with the threats with veteran trees, compaction, very common. Here we have, you see the effects of compaction, no drainage around that oak. The vents, big problem. Compaction again on roots. Disease, of course, this bacterial canker on the left. And of course, people climbing over trees, people pressure, huge problem. When undertaking any management of veteran trees, overarching aim, where possible, should be keep trees for as long as possible whilst maintaining the values these trees offer. It should be borne in mind that the best management option may be to do nothing. And that just harks back to what Paul was saying as well. An assessment of its structural condition and vitality is essential to gauge what intervention is needed and if appropriate. The tree's ability to recover successfully. And I'll just fly through these pictures. Here's some beaches, born in beaches outside London. You can see the fencing, so that's kept the people away. The few props in there to support some limbs, very hollow beech tree. Again, some more supports. Now, when protecting the root environment, really important, particularly from compaction, 15 times the diameter of the trunk or 5 meters beyond the crown spread, whichever is greater. And always avoid sudden changes when managing or dealing with particularly old trees. Of course, the easiest thing is to move the targets, reroute pathways, move benches. Here's some air tilling where we decompacting the soil and adding in a soil improver as well. And a little bit of fencing around the trees just to avoid people climbing. These are trees in Old Bridge Estate, fantastic circle of yew trees. Tree work to prevent structural damage. This tree has been reduced, and a non-invasive cobra belt system put in the main stem to keep that together. So that tree can be kept certainly in the short, medium term. And again, the type of pruning when dealing with veteran trees, we keep away from the Shigo type of management. So we do what some people might look upon as bad pruning. We would leave some stumps, and these stumps just allow more regrowth, more reaction to come back, and hopefully the crown can be produced. A new crown can be produced lower down. So the VetCert is a project that's run by the Ancient Tree Forum in England, which is a fantastic group run by some really enthusiastic people. So anyone interested in getting educated in veteran tree management, I'd suggest you look up that. And indeed, the Ancient Tree Forum, that website, fantastic website, very interesting. I thoroughly recommend everyone to look at that and to look through it. Some great information on that. So hopefully I'm in the time. Thanks for listening. Cheers.
Hello. I'm Alejandra, one of the students. Thank you so much, Cormac, for your wonderful presentation. It was really interesting. So one of the questions from the audience was, is there any legislation in Ireland that protects veteran trees? Or...
There's no legislation that would protect veteran trees specifically. No. And it's a question that's been asked before. Should there be legislation? I suppose it's covered. I suppose in people would say it's covered in planning law, but it's not. It wouldn't be very effective, I have to say. We have tree preservation orders in this country. They have been used, not greatly used, I have to say, but there's no specific protection for veteran trees.
Okay.
Yeah, just looking at the chat, and that is a very big talking point, Cormac, all right, is the whole thing of, I guess, interactions with our local authorities. If we see a tree that we think needs protecting, or is there officers for that? Do the local authorities have an actual department to deal with?
Yeah, well, I think that a TPO has to go through the planning process. It's put on. I suppose if there is a particular tree you would think would need protection, you certainly can go to the local council and request it, and they then have to go through a process that does go through the planning process.
Right. Okay. That's an overall theme. I think, look, thanks for that. That was a really detailed, and there's some great comments coming in that probably you can't see. They're all really good. And it's really up to me to all of the three speakers tonight, Nikki, Paul and Cormac, and thanks very much. The comments I can see this, and also to all the participants who tuned in such large numbers. And a really interesting webinar. Back to Nature was the theme, of course. And this is our last leadership program for the students. And I guess to thank Louise and Margie and Christine, and not forgetting John and Deirdre in the background as well, for a really interesting year. I think if we were all to put our hands in our hearts, when the leadership module was the one that everyone dreaded, but in fact, I think everybody had a great time, and we all learned something out of it, some really useful stuff. So I'm just going to hand back to, I can see Louise in the background. I think I've got everybody there, Louise. And again, thanks to the speakers, thanks to the participants, and on behalf of the students, thanks to our tutors. And that's it. It's kind of over and out from there. I'm going to hand it back to you, Louise.
Thank you very much, John. I think that was a wonderful night, very inspiring. I have to say, I'm looking forward to getting out into the garden and into the wild over the weekend. And we thank so much for giving up your time this evening. I want to say thank you to all the students, and on behalf of everybody in the college. It has been an amazing few months, different online, but it's been an absolute pleasure. And we've really enjoyed having you in the college with us this year. We will have the recording of tonight available on the Teagasc website from tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that.
Very enjoyable year. I think a year with a difference, but I think it worked really, really well. Their presentations, they gelled well together as a group with technology, everything. It just was a super year, and I really enjoyed it. And I'd be sorry to have missed meeting you on the virtual scene, but we're not saying goodbye. We're going to say we'll see you next year in level 6. And just looking through there's a lot of our past pupils have joined us, and it's great to see you there. And we hope to see you too back in the gardens when we're back there again. So thanks again for everything, guys. I really enjoyed your company. And thanks to the 3 speakers. I think you're excellent. Cormac, there's an awful lot of information there on about trees. We could never go through it all in one night. But we look forward to seeing them in the park and the other parks that you're involved with as well. So I wish you the best during the summer. See you in September.
All the best now. Bye-bye.